Welcome to the Liberation Lab podcast, insights and interviews for the disruptive educator. Listen, y'all, it's a solo episode, and I want to start out with a question today. And the question is, have you ever lost your way? Maybe you started out in the teaching profession, in education, with a desire to see the flourishing of our young people. Maybe you started and your heart and fervor was for every single young person in your care to have those aha moments and to see the magic happen in classrooms. But somewhere along the way, what once was a desire to see kids flourishing became about self preservation, maybe is the mismanagement, micromanagement of leadership. Maybe it could be any number of things, but somewhere along the line, your fire and passion got dimmed. As I sit here to record this episode, I want to tell you that I realized that in this year alone, as I began year one being in the principal's chair, that I saw it happening with myself. Every deed, every word matters. Everything you say and do matters. And it either can build positively into the school culture that you are desiring or it subtracts from it. There is no in between. So let me give you a quick story. It is the day before our Thanksgiving break. True story. The staff has decided to join together to do a potluck. Well, I want to surprise them and contribute, so I go get some donuts from this local bakery that everyone really enjoys, and I bring them, and coffee from my admin team. We bring them in and just thank them, let our staff know how grateful we are for them. And when I do that, one of the teachers sees me and says, "It's Mr. Morgan with the donuts. Like, I missed this, Mr." And she knows who she is. So if she ever hears this episode, shout out to you because you got me thinking. But I see her at the end of the day and she says, "Listen, I just want to let you know that I like seeing this principle back." And what she was alluding to was year one, maybe year two of my AP role in the school. There was a lot of connection building, a lot of relationship building that took the form of little things like, "Hey, have some coffee with your AP." And somehow along the way, between the pressures of the job and trying to hit all these different measures that are being used to justify or to say that I am doing my job, somehow in that mess, I frankly lost my joy. And what do you do when you feel like you've lost your way? What is your response supposed to be? It's been my experience that most people will point elsewhere. That is, in education, we point to things like standardized testing. We point to things like teacher retention, the red tape and politics of it all. We point to things like the micromanagement of local school boards and other external issues such as poverty, lack of resources, and things like that. But as I think about it, here's a question that I keep coming back to. How is it that a profession that is supposed to be centered on care has become so hampered that the growth of the human existence, the growth of the human spirit, and all that is entailed causes you to lose heart? Or to say it another way, how is it that that a profession that is grounded or supposed to be grounded in love and care makes you feel like you have to lose all of those things in order to preserve yourself? And here's what I've learned. No one tells you how much you'll be judged in the chair of principal. No one tells you that you will be judged from above and below. Every decision that you make comes with scrutiny of those that you lead and serve while also having to appease those above you. No one tells you that the calendar invitations don't stop, that the emails won't cease, that the knocks on the door of your office don't stop, that the phone continues to ring. Between the school boards and their expectations, parents that want you to drop everything and meet with them immediately, staff that has their expectations, students that you have to serve and empower, and the larger community, which also has a story in and stake in your school. There is always pressure coming, and there is no way to manage it all. So, what do you do? If you're hoping that I will solve education's problems in this podcast, let me just go ahead and set your expectations now. This is not that space. But part of the issue, I believe, is that we have misdiagnosed the challenges that we faced. We have misdiagnosed the challenges that we face. You see, for many problems that exist in our lives, we can solve them by way of calling in an expert. We call the doctors to help us get healthy. We call mechanics to help us fix our cars. We call lawyers if we need legal counsel or have a case. We have parents that are supposed to teach appropriate behaviors and so on and so forth. And typically in these situations, when you give folks the authority to fix your issue, they come through. But these are technical issues. But there are other challenges that experts, when called in, can't answer, that leadership is often asked to solve. I'll give you some examples. A mechanic can fix your brake pads, but they cannot remedy, for example, my grandmother. She was an anxious person, She would often, as she's driving, ride the brake pedal. Like at every turn, there would be she'd push the accelerator, but then she would ride the brake pedal. Now, hear me, the mechanic can replace and fix your pads and rotors, can make sure that brakes are functioning properly, but the mechanic can't stop my grandmother from riding the pedal. You can go to a trainer that can give you a workout regimen and give you a meal plan, but they can't stop you from sneaking cookies or unhealthy eating habits. You see, I think the problem comes in because, to borrow from that last analogy, we would rather have a pill that would keep us from gaining weight from sweets than actually stopping the behavior that contributes to that thing. I'd rather the pill because the pill does not require me to change my behavior. It doesn't cost me anything. And so we would rather, or we misdiagnose, I think, in education, technical issues. That is, when you call in an expert and they fix the thing with their technique, and adaptive issues. Solutions don't lie in the technique, but rather in people themselves. So, as a leader, I am required to serve, lead, and support folks that want technical solutions to adaptive issues. And so when I am challenging folks to be better about their planning process, when I'm challenging folks to actually look at what the standard says so we can make sure that kids have access to grade level things, all of those things are costly. They ask you to give up what was once normal to you, what was once a status quo type of thing. So, what do you do when folks are consistently misdiagnosing the technique and the adaptive? I think that's the question. Here's what I've learned thus far in my leadership journey, that if I don't ground myself in the understanding of the problems that we seek to solve, then I will continue to put pressure on myself to fix things with technique that are not fixable with technique only. That it requires people to actually do the inner work necessary to lead and serve in a way that brings the adaptive change. So the question is how? Well, let me pause right there because the title of this episode is The Silent Scream of School Leadership. And here's why I entitled it that. That if we are not careful with these expectations that and demands that we place on school leadership at every level. And let me be clear here. When I say school leadership, I'm not just talking about principals, because if you need a title in order to consider yourself a leader, then you're missing the mark already. Leadership begins before a title. And so when it comes to the solutions that we seek, we must continue to push ourselves to look inward for the solutions that we need. There's no magic pill that's going to reform education. There's no there's no magic formula that's going to help us navigate what is going to be the new normal of the coming 4 years of this next presidency. We have to be willing to take a hard look in the mirror collectively. And so at every stage of school leadership, at every stage of leadership within your school, students, staff, office staff, custodians, principals, teachers, for you counselors, whoever you might be, school psychologists, there are some things that I think we must consider if we're going to truly embrace adaptive leadership. And here's the point to that. When I was younger, I grew up in a different time, if you will, I grew up in a time of what I like to call community meetings, where if I was doing the wrong thing or seen doing the wrong thing, the neighbor had permission to get on me, pop me if they needed to, send me home. My grandmother would be home first, or my grandfather home first. He had permission to get on me, and then I had to get it again from my grandmother. It was a community of accountability, if you will. And while I'm not advocating for violence or anything like that, what I am saying is that folks all had a desire to see the growth and change in me. And so they all held me accountable to that end. But when my grandmother in particular got a hold of me and she wanted to communicate non-verbally, if you will, there would be a point where she would pop me real good and I had to silent scream. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about, feel free to fast forward just a little bit. But the silent scream happens when one, they either tell you you better be quiet before I give you something to cry about, or two, it happens when you've experienced a level of unexpected anguish or pain that your cry goes on mute. And that's what I think happens when we are trying to relate adaptive issues and trying to apply technique to them. The school leader has to let out that silent cry because we are unduly putting pressure on him or her to do the job that they themselves cannot do. There is no technique that the school leader or the teacher or the student or the school counselor or the custodian can do to solve the ills of education. So how then do we move forward? And while this is not an exhaustive list, nor is it a solution to all the things, I do want you to remember 5 C's, just because it helps me remember them. The first C is community. We got to build community. If you remove a log from a fire, it guarantees that the flame from that log dies out. And that typically you find that folks who burn out or lose their fire for education isolate themselves and don't have the same community they once did. And here's what I mean when I say community, just so we're clear. Community happens when I make your problem my problem. And sure, going alone is faster, but it also ensures that the change that you seek stops when you do. That if you're really trying to build success and ingrain that in the culture of your school, then you should be the person that builds community, that there is collective responsibility for the vision and for the mission of your school. That school culture doesn't just come down to whether or not you're seen in the hallway as many times as everyone expects you as the principal. That whether or not you're standing in the hallway at every transition. That whether or not these things matter. Don't hear me. Hear me. These things matter. But if we fail to collectively do our part to hone in on the non negotiables that we must seek together, then none of the change we seek happens. So we must build community where I make your problem my problem. That requires listening, communication, honesty, tough conversations, rooted and grounded in our collective understanding that even in the rough patches, the end goal is that we would all be growing and pushing and learning together. But not only that, the second C is critics. You must turn your critics into coaches. The people whose perspectives you most need to understand are those upset at your agenda. So when you have come in to seek to put people on a path towards the change that you believe in, that you want to see for the school, and there are folks who are upset at that, those are the people that you really need to pull in closer. There's a teacher at my uh, that I serve alongside that is, I'm going to say, has the potential to be the biggest detractor in my building. And here's the thing. I don't believe for a second that this person gets up every day and says, I'm going to make life hard for my principal. I believe that they are thoroughly convinced that their way is better. And so what do you do when you're charged with trying to lead folks who have competing agendas, who believe that what you're asking them to do pulls them into the unfamiliar and therefore they got a problem with you? I want to know why you disagree with me. I want to know what it is that you feel like is wrong with my plan, that's wrong with the vision that I've set forth for the school, that the collective vision that me and many have taken hold of. What's wrong with it? It is those folks that help you refine. It is those folks that help you see what it is that you're asking folks to give up, which brings us to number 3. You must count the cost. Adaptive leadership is costly. The interesting thing is, or however you want to describe it, the inauguration that will take place is next year is going to be done on the day we celebrate the life and legacy of Martin Luther King. And one of the things that King did was put on display for the world to see America's gap between their values and their behaviors. That there was a gap that exists between what America chooses to believe about itself and what America actually behaves like in its execution. That the nonviolent protests and putting things in the face of every single person who would listen and see that the king had a way and a plan that would close the gap between values and behavior. Adaptive leadership does that to people. It puts you in position to where you have to look at the chasm that exists between your values and your behavior, your expectations and your execution. When you are asking folks to change, you are asking them to give up something, and that is costly. And if you are going to be any leader worth your salt, you must acknowledge the cost of what it is that you are going to call people into. That yes, when you walk in here, you're going to be uncomfortable. You're going to have to give up your way of doing things. That doesn't mean that you lose all of yourself in the process, but it does mean you must embrace the unfamiliar. When you choose to count the cost, you are putting yourself in position. You are putting yourself in position to acknowledge the loss that people will suffer when you ask them to leave behind something that they lived with for years. To tell a teacher or to tell a school leader or to tell someone that they should stop being prejudiced or biased is really telling them that they have to give up their lessons that they've learned from a loving grandparent. To tell them that their grandfather was wrong, their grandmother was wrong. That sometimes we don't personalize what it is that people believe because it's so abhorrent to us, but it is personal to them. It is not enough for any leader to just point to a hopeful future. They need to know that you realize that the change you're asking them to do is so difficult, and that you're asking them to give up things that have real value with them. Which brings me to number 4, casualties. Any change, any significant adaptive change that benefits your school, that benefits the organization, will clearly and tangibly hurt people who have existed and thrived under the status quo. And if there are people who cannot or will refuse to go with you along that change, then hear me, there will be casualties. Some people can't make the journey with you. And at some point, you must choose between keeping people or making progress. And if you are unwilling to sustain casualties, you are telling folks that your goals aren't that important. You give people permission to ignore you because there's nothing that you are going to do about it, except that some people just can't make the journey with you. And I mean this at every level. If your pursuit of excellence in yourself causes some folks who've been complacent with the status quo to look at you with a side eye, then maybe they just can't go with you. And that doesn't mean that you can fire them if they're your teacher with you, if they serve on the same line of things with you. But it does mean that you can choose who you associate with, who you build community with. And maybe that's the casualty. You can't build with them anymore. That you got to set up boundaries. When you walk into the teacher lounge and you see them, you got to walk back out. But your ability to accept the harsh reality of these casualties sends a clear message about your courage and commitment to seeing the adaptive change through. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody who's behind you needs to get off. You got to be the person that is willing to go back and help people move forward if they are willing. But it does mean that inevitably there will be casualties. But number 5, complicity. We are all complicit. When you address important issues in the school or place that you serve, you share a responsibility for the problems that exist. Let me tell on myself, because why not? For 2 years, I served as the assistant principal of the building that I serve now as the principal. For 2 years, I could very easily tell you why instructional leadership wasn't happening in my position. I could tell you that I served with others and my role was that of discipline and my role was that of supporting teachers with student behaviors. I could tell you that I was checking boxes, but wasn't necessarily coaching teachers to be their best, even though I wanted to. Hear me. That doesn't change the fact that I was complicit with not pushing people to be instructionally their best. And I have to own that. That's on me. I'm not going to put the blame on anyone else. I'm not going to outsource solutions. No, I'm going to look in the mirror and say, you know what, Bobby, you have ownership. You have responsibility for your piece of this mess. Now, I want you to envision with me that you and I, whoever you are listening at this time, have our phones, some books, some pens, some cords, some charging cables, some post-its, all in a pile. It is yours and it is mine. And we are sitting there pointing at the pile, talking about how big a mess it is and how terrible it is that it exists. But neither one of us will pick up our own mess. Now imagine, just for a second, that I reach in and I take out my phone and I organize it. I take out my charging cords, my post-its, my books, everything that belongs to me in this mess that we have made. I take it out and I organize it. What that has done is 2 things. One, I've taken responsibility for my part of the mess without pointing to you and telling you what you need to do. But 2, it makes it so much easier for you to clean up yours because mine's not in the way anymore. Your job as a school leader, your job as a leader in any part of your school building is to address the issues while accepting responsibility for the mess itself. Don't skip this part. Don't be the person who outsources the responsibility of all the things that have gone wrong to everyone else, but then point to yourself when all the successes happen. You see, me, I made that happen. I made that success happen, but you didn't have any part of the mess. Any joker with two eyes can see that if you serve in a building, that you have your part of the mess to clean up as much as you're part of the celebration when the magic happens. So for me, I'm committed to this process of adaptive leadership and change and growth and development, but I'm committed to reclaiming joy in the process. I saw myself becoming cynical, sarcastic more than I'd like to be, even though sarcastic is my love language. Sarcasm is my love language to some degree, but being cynical, losing my joy, putting myself in position to not lead and model what I want to consistently see in my team, that's on me. And I got to do better. And the reason that I'm putting this out and I want you to hear it and being raw and real about my shortcomings is because I think there's so much of the experts who want to tell you about what you have to change and how you got to do things, but nobody who steps up and says, yo, I am blowing it and I need to be better. And I'm going to publicly make it so that you have access not just to the things that I do well, but sometimes when I'm not doing it right. That as I work to close the gap between my expectations of myself and my execution, that others get to witness, that as I close the gap between my values and my behavior, that it would help you do the same in your life. Education can't save us. We got to save education. In the words of Bettina Love, Dr. Bettina Love. So my hope is that this silent scream from the pain and shock of trying to apply technical solutions that require adaptive ones now gets changed to the voice of a leader who accepts responsibility for the casualties, who accepts responsibility, for the complicity, who's willing to accept the casualty, who will count the cost in closing the gap between values and behavior, who will turn their critics into coaches, but who will also build community. Our schools deserve this. So my hope is we'd all walk in it. If you have gotten this far, thank you. I appreciate you. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Liberation Lab podcast. If you've received any value from it, could you like, follow, subscribe? It really helps us expand our reach. I hope that as we're building community together, that you wouldn't just be a consumer of the content, but you would help me to expand and push this out to more folks who can be encouraged and join us as we continue to fight for a more liberatory education for all. So thank y'all for tapping in. Until next time, let's keep pushing.